May the 1st, 1982. The South Atlantic is flat and metallic, a sheet of cold steel stretching to the horizon. Above it, the sky is low, bruised and heavy with cloud. This is not a sky that forgives mistakes. At 20,000 feet, a Mirage III slices through the air, its delta wings humming with stored energy. The Attar engine screams behind the pilot like a living thing, hot and hungry. Every gauge in the cockpit confirms what he already believes in his bones. Speed is life. Altitude is safety. Momentum is authority. On his radar, a contact blooms, slow, too slow, a Sea Harrier. Back in briefing rooms weeks earlier, men had laughed at this aircraft, a jump jet, a curiosity, something designed to wobble off a carrier deck, impress crowds at air shows, then get out of the way of real fighters, subsonic, stubby, ugly. Against a Mach 2 interceptor, it should not even be here. The Mirage pilot rolls slightly, aligns his nose, and pushes the throttle forward. The jet responds instantly, lunging ahead. The geometry is perfect, high to low, fast to slow, predator to prey. The missile seeker is already warming, already waiting for heat. This is what fighter pilots are taught to trust, in numbers, closure rate, energy states, equations that have been proven again and again in classrooms and wars. Then the equations collapse. The Harrier does not turn, it does not dive, it does not run. Instead, it does something no fixed-wing aircraft is supposed to do at speed. It decelerates, not gradually, not smoothly, but violently, as if it has struck an invisible wall hanging in the sky. The Mirage pilot's eyes widen. His brain rejects what it sees. At nearly 700 knots, he expects the target to stretch forward to remain ahead of his nose. Instead, the distance between them vanishes in an instant. The Harrier swells in his canopy, frozen, unnaturally steady. Then it is gone. The Mirage screams past in a gray blur. The airframe shudders as the pilot yanks the stick, trying to bleed speed, trying to claw his way back into a turn his aircraft was never meant to make at this energy state. It is already over. Behind him, a growl rises in his headset. High-pitched, mechanical, patient. The sound of a sidewinder finding home. Back on the mainland, radar operators stare at their scopes. Two blips that should have merged into one clean kill instead do something else. They cross, they separate, and then one simply disappears. Static fills the radios, then silence. By nightfall, the tone in Argentine operations rooms has changed. The bravado is gone. Helmets sit untouched on tables. Cigarette smoke hangs low, trapped beneath fluorescent lights. Pilots talk over each other, voices tight, clipped, embarrassed by what they are saying. It didn't turn, it didn't stall, it just stopped. They are not amateurs. These men have trained on French and American doctrine. They know MiGs. They know phantoms. They know that a jet without forward motion becomes a brick. Lift dies. Control surfaces go soft. Gravity wins, but the British jets are not falling. They are killing. Maps are rolled out. Casings weigh down the corners. Someone traces flight paths with a finger, trying to force logic back into the picture. The Sea Harrier is slow, heavy. It should be helpless once cornered, unless the rules they are using no longer apply. Manuals are pulled from shelves. Technical diagrams of the Harrier's engine are studied under harsh light. Everyone in the room knows the basics. The Pegasus engine is famous. 4 nozzles, too cold, too hot. Thrust vector downward to lift the aircraft vertically, for takeoff, for landing. That part is not mysterious. What is mysterious is why the British pilots are still alive after doing it in combat, because every manual says the same thing. Rotate the nozzles in forward flight and airflow into the intakes destabilizes. Compressor stall, flame out, loss of control, structural stress that can tear mounts apart. In short, don't do it. Yet the reports insist otherwise. Harriers ballooning upward, overshoots happening too fast to react, dogfights turning inside out. Someone mutters a word that spreads faster than the data. Black Death. By mid-May, the war has thickened into something uglier. The British fleet pushes into San Carlos water. The Argentine Air Force throws everything it has at the anchorage. Skyhawks and daggers skim the waves so low that salt spray coats their canopies. Missiles from ships are terrifying, but they are predictable. The real fear lives above the clouds. Sea Harriers patrol like dark insects against the overcast. Always there, always watching. They do not chase, they wait. Argentine pilots are given new instructions now. Keep your speed. Do not turn. Do not dogfight. Extend and run. It goes against instinct, against pride, against everything they were trained to do. And still, it keeps happening. A dagger lines up a Harrier. The angle is perfect. The shot should be easy. Instead, the British jet jumps. Not forward, not sideways. Up, a sharp, brutal vertical movement, as if the aircraft has been yanked by a cable tied to the sky. Cannon fire rips through empty air. The dagger overshoots. In the canopy reflection, the pilot catches a glimpse of something wrong. Exhaust, not trailing behind, but blasting downward from rotating nozzles buried in the fuselage. Smoke where smoke should not be. The Harrier is no longer flying in the way they understand flying. It is balancing, hanging, supported by something other than airflow over wings. In debrief rooms, fists slam tables, helmets are thrown, voices crack. A fixed-wing aircraft cannot do that, but it is doing it anyway. Among the listeners is a man who does not wear Argentine insignia. He does not speak. He writes, line after line in a small notebook. He has seen VTOL aircraft before. The Soviet Yak-38 is one of them. He knows how useless it is in a fight. This is different. If what these pilots are describing is true, then speed is no longer king. Energy is no longer safety. And an entire generation of fighters, fast, sleek, arrow-shaped, has just become vulnerable. Out over the gray water, a Sea Harrier rolls gently onto patrol, its small wings steady in the turbulence. To anyone watching from below, it looks almost harmless. But inside the cockpit, one hand rests close to a lever no other fighter pilot in the world possesses. A lever the manual says should never be touched at speed. A lever that, when pulled, does not just change how the aircraft moves. It changes what the enemy believes is possible, and that belief is about to break completely. The problem is not that the Argentine pilots lack skill. It is that skill cannot compensate for a battlefield that no longer behaves the way it is supposed to. By mid-May, the air war over the Falklands has entered a strange, unstable phase. On paper, the numbers still favor Argentina. Faster aircraft, comparable missiles, pilots trained in European and American doctrines, interceptors designed to dominate exactly this kind of engagement. But in the air, none of that translates cleanly anymore. Every encounter that stretches beyond the first pass carries a growing sense of danger. Pilots feel it before they can explain it. A tightening in the chest, a reluctance to commit, a hesitation that did not exist before May 1st. They begin to talk about distance, not position, about avoiding certain angles, about keeping the fight moving forward, always forward, never allowing it to slow down, because slowing down is where the Harrier lives. Argentine pilots start to notice a pattern. The British jets do not chase aggressively. They do not try to outrun anyone. Instead, they allow the engagement to collapse. They let the faster aircraft close. They accept being hunted. This feels wrong. In traditional air combat, being slow and defensive is a temporary condition, a prelude to defeat. A slower aircraft is supposed to bleed options until it has none left. But the Sea Harrier seems comfortable there. A dagger pilot experiences it during what should be a routine engagement. Two aircraft meet, head-on, break, and immediately enter a scissors. Back and forth, left, right. Each pilot waiting for the other to make a mistake, to bleed speed too fast. This is familiar territory. This is where training takes over. The Harrier should lose. Instead, at the apex of the maneuver, something breaks. The Harrier's nose does not drift through the turn as expected. It snaps. A sudden, violent change in attitude that looks less like flying and more like rotation. The aircraft does not carve an arc through the sky. It makes a corner. The dagger overshoots underneath, so close the pilot later swears he could see heat distortion rippling along the Harrier's fuselage. In that instant, the geometry flips completely. The Harrier is no longer defensive. It is aiming. What the Argentine pilot feels next is not fear yet. It is confusion, a deep, almost physical disorientation. The mental model he uses to predict where aircraft will be in the next second has failed him. His hands move, but too late. The missile warning tone rises, shrill and unforgiving. By the time the smoke clears, another aircraft is gone. In debrief rooms, the language begins to degrade. Pilots struggle to describe what they saw. They stop using formal terms and start using gestures, metaphors, fragments. It jumped. It hung there. It climbed without climbing. Engineers and intelligence officers listen, increasingly uneasy. These are not hallucinations. Too many pilots are describing the same impossible thing. Photographs are collected. Gun camera footage is slowed down frame by frame. In one blurred image, a detail stands out that refuses to be ignored. The exhaust is wrong. Instead of streaming straight behind the aircraft, the plume is angled downward, thick and dark, erupting from nozzles under the wing roots. The Harrier is not just producing thrust. It is redirecting it. At this point, the mystery shifts from superstition to dread. Because if the Harrier is actively vectoring thrust during combat, if it is using engine power to change its velocity vector instead of relying on lift alone, then every assumption about how a dogfight unfolds becomes unstable. This is no longer about turn rate versus wing loading. This is about control authority. A Soviet observer embedded as an intelligence liaison listens carefully as the reports pile up. He has seen VTOL aircraft before. The Yak-38 is proof that vertical lift does not equal combat capability. The Yak is heavy, underpowered, and despised by its pilots. The Harrier should be the same, but it isn't. And that realization sends a ripple of unease through everything he knows about air combat. His country's fighters are designed to be arrows, fast, straight, lethal at range. They assume the enemy must obey inertia. The Harrier does not. One report in particular stops him cold. An Argentine pilot describes a scissors engagement that ends not in a stall, but in a snap turn. The target pivoted, the transcript reads. It didn't bank, it rotated. A square turn. For a fixed-wing aircraft, this should not exist. Turns are arcs. The tighter the arc, the more speed you lose. To turn sharply without space requires either magic or thrust, acting as a control surface. If this is true, then speed has lost its monopoly on survival. Back over the islands, desperation drives experimentation. Argentine commanders begin searching for the Harrier's limits. If it relies on thrust, then thin air should starve it. High altitude should restore the natural order, force the Harrier up. On a cold June morning, a Mirage squadron leader spots a lone Sea Harrier patrolling higher than usual. He signals his wingman to stay low and climbs hard, afterburner lighting the sky behind him. This is the Mirage's domain: thin air, long climbs, pure energy fighting. He dives from above, clean and fast. The Harrier turns into him, shedding speed. Good. They spiral downward. The Mirage presses, refusing to disengage. Airspeed drops, 300 knots, 250. The Mirage is approaching the edge of its comfort zone, but the commander believes the Harrier will break first. It doesn't. Instead, the Harrier does something that finally destroys the illusion. With barely any forward speed, its nose pitches violently upward, pointing almost straight into the sky. The aircraft hangs there, supported not by lift, but by raw thrust redirected downward. It is not flying anymore. It is balancing. The Mirage slides past helplessly, its delta wings starved, its controls soft. In that moment, the commander understands the truth with terrifying clarity. He has forced the Harrier into its strongest state. Above him, the British jet pivots calmly, almost mechanically. The nozzles rotate back. The nose comes down. The missile tone screams. The Mirage dives, clawing for speed, but the geometry is already sealed. The explosion tears the aircraft apart. The pilot ejects into the freezing Atlantic, watching the wreckage of a Mach 2 interceptor burn on the water. Floating beneath his parachute, the realization settles in. They are not fighting an aircraft governed by aerodynamics alone. They are fighting a thrust vector with wings attached. The final pieces fall into place far from the battlefield. Analysts reconstruct the maneuver step by step. The Sea Harrier's Rolls-Royce Pegasus engine is not just powerful, it is flexible. 4 rotating nozzles allow thrust to be redirected in flight. In the cockpit, a single lever controls them. The manual restricts its use to takeoff and landing. The British pilots ignore that restriction. They use the lever as a weapon. At the exact moment an enemy commits, when closure rate is highest and reaction time is lowest, they rotate the nozzles just enough to do 2 things at once. They steal their own forward thrust, converting it into lift. And they expose the aircraft's blunt shape to immense drag. The result is catastrophic for the attacker. Instant deceleration. A sudden vertical balloon. To the pilot behind, it looks like the Harrier has slammed into an invisible wall. The overshoot is inevitable. By the time the attacker realizes what has happened, the fight is already lost. Viffing is not elegant. It is violent. The forces slam pilots into their harnesses. The airflow into the engine teeters on collapse. A mistake can kill the pilot without enemy intervention. But the Pegasus engine holds. Again. And again. By early June, Argentine pilots are no longer thinking about winning dogfights. They are thinking about surviving encounters. Bombs are released early. Attack runs are rushed. The sky feels unpredictable, untrustworthy. Because once the Harrier slows the world down, speed no longer saves you. And somewhere beyond the fear and the wreckage, one final truth is becoming impossible to ignore. This was not a trick. It was a new axis of air combat, and no one else knew how to fight on it. By the second week of June, the air war is no longer a contest. It is a condition. Argentine pilots still fly. Missions are still launched. Bombs still fall. But something essential has changed. The sky is no longer neutral ground governed by familiar rules. It has become hostile in a way no training syllabus prepared them for. When a Sea Harrier appears on radar, the reaction is no longer aggressive. It is cautious, then hesitant, then restrained. Speed is no longer a guarantee of escape. Being behind the enemy is no longer an advantage. The old geometry, pursuit curves, lead angles, closure rates, feels unreliable, as if the math itself has started lying. The British do not dominate the air with numbers. They dominate it with predictability, not of motion, but of outcome. Every Sea Harrier pilot now understands exactly what their aircraft can do that others cannot. The nozzle lever beside the throttle has become something more than a system control. It is a timing device, a switch that, for a few violent seconds, allows the pilot to decide when momentum matters, and when it does not. But this advantage is not clean. It is not safe. Each time a Harrier pilot commits to vectoring and forward flight, they are walking a narrow edge between control and catastrophe. The deceleration is savage. The aircraft shudders as thrust is ripped away from the axis it was meant to follow. The pilot is slammed forward into the straps, vision tunneling, organs lagging behind bone. Inside the engine, airflow becomes a negotiation. Compressor blades spin at the edge of tolerance. Intake pressure fluctuates. A fraction too much nozzle rotation, a fraction too late in the maneuver, and the Pegasus will cough. Flameout. Loss of thrust. At that moment, the Harrier does not become a fighter. It becomes a falling object. There is no fly-by-wire system to save it, no envelope protection, no computer veto, only the pilot's judgment and the engine's mechanical forgiveness. That forgiveness holds again and again, and every time it does, another Argentine aircraft disappears from the sky. The kill ratio climbs into numbers that feel implausible even to those recording them. More than 20 Argentine aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. 0 Sea Harriers lost the same way. Not one. The statistics are not just embarrassing, they are destabilizing. They imply that something fundamental has shifted, not incrementally, not theoretically, but decisively. In Buenos Aires, planners search for explanations that do not require admitting failure of doctrine. Fatigue, poor coordination, bad luck. But the pilots know better. They felt it in their hands, in their guts, in the sickening moment when the world slowed down in front of them and their aircraft refused to follow. They had done everything right, and still, they died. For the Soviet observers, the implications are darker. The Falklands conflict was never supposed to matter strategically. It was small, distant, peripheral, but what it revealed threatens the core assumptions of an entire air doctrine. For decades, Soviet fighter design has followed a clear philosophy. Speed equals survival. Interceptors are built to sprint, to climb, to strike, and disengage before a fight can tighten. Maneuverability is secondary. Dogfights are relics. The Sea Harrier shatters this logic. It demonstrates that if thrust itself can be controlled, then speed is no longer the only currency of air combat, that an aircraft can aim without flying forward. That direction and velocity can be separated, briefly, brutally, but long enough to kill. The Harrier does not merely win engagements, it exposes a vulnerability. When the war ends on June 14th, the world's attention shifts quickly. Surrenders, diplomacy, political fallout. The Falklands are filed away as a strange, lopsided conflict. But in hangars, test facilities, and design bureaus across the world, something else begins. Engineers study combat footage frame by frame. They watch Harriers balloon upward under fire, watch enemy jets streak past, watch noses pivot in ways aerodynamics textbooks say should not happen. Analysts redraw diagrams where curved pursuit paths are replaced by sharp angles and sudden reversals. One word appears again and again in classified memos: decoupling. The separation of pointing from motion. The Sea Harrier did not invent thrust vectoring, but it proved, under fire, that it could be weaponized, that a pilot willing to risk engine stability could rewrite a fight in seconds. Years later, new aircraft will emerge with this lesson baked into their design. Nozzles that move by computer command. Engines that vector thrust without sacrificing control. Fighters that can turn tighter, aim sooner, and survive where pure aerodynamics would fail. They will be faster than the Harrier. They will be sleeker. They will be safer. But their lineage traces back to this cold, improvised violence over the South Atlantic. For the Argentine pilots who survived, the legacy is not technological. It is psychological. They remember the moment when training stopped helping, when instinct betrayed them, when being behind the enemy felt more dangerous than being chased. They remember the stillness, that impossible pause in the sky, where time seemed to hesitate and geometry lost its authority. For the British pilots, there is no myth of invincibility, only fatigue, only the memory of pulling a lever that the manual warned against, trusting that metal and fuel and airflow would hold together one more time. The Harrier did not win because it was superior in every way. It won because it turned limitation into leverage, because it took the one thing it was mocked for, being slow, and used it to break the enemy's understanding of how combat worked. It taught the sky a new rule, that momentum is not control, and speed is not dominance. And for a brief violent season over the Falklands, a small, awkward aircraft proved that wars are not always decided by who moves fastest, but by who is willing to stop at exactly the right moment.